So welcome to our webinar today, When is Science Newsworthy? Before we get started, just a little bit about who we are. So this is part of AGU Sharing Science program, which I'll talk about in a second, but my name is Shane Hanlon. I'm in the Sharing Science program proper, and you're not going to hear that much from me today, but I'll let Lauren and Nancy introduce themselves as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Lauren LaPuma. I work in the AGU's Public Information Office, so I help to publicize newsworthy research published in AGU journals and presented at AGU meetings.
And I'm Nancy Botley, and I'm the manager of the Public Information Office here at AGU.
And we have two guests with us as well today. We have Carolyn Gramling from Science News and Ben Guarino from the Washington Post, and so I'll let each of them introduce themselves really quickly.
Hi everyone, I am Carolyn Gramling. I am with Science News Magazine in Washington, D.C., and I am their Earth and climate writer.
Hi, and I'm Ben Guarino. I'm with the Washington Post Speaking of Science section. I cover everything from new breaking research to the politics and culture of science.
Great. Thanks all. So just quickly, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Sharing Science program, so I'm part of the program proper. We also work with our press office, our government relations office, but our whole goal is to help scientists communicate what they do to broader audiences, whether that's policymakers, whether that's just general non-scientists, or in a specific case, to members of the press. And we do this through a whole number of ways. We do workshops, we do webinars like this, we provide a whole bunch of resources, outreach opportunities, hands-on support, what have you. So you'll hear from me at the end of the webinar about more of this, but for now, we'll let Lauren and Nancy take it away.
Great, thanks, Shane. So, we really want Carolyn and Ben to give you, their point of view on what makes science newsworthy. But before we get to them, I'm just going to give you all a brief overview of kind of what a public information office does and what we look for in terms of newsworthy science. So every institution has a public information office of some sort. It can be called many different things. It might be the press office, media relations, communications, but the main point is to publicize newsworthy research. And many scientific societies like AGU also have public information offices. So here at AGU, we publicize the research that's published in our journals and presented at our meetings. And so our role is to, like I said, publicize newsworthy research, but we're also the link between U.S. scientists and reporters at all kinds of news outlets. We connect you with reporters in many different ways, and we publicize your science to reporters so that they can cover it when they want to. And we may do this in many different ways. We might write a press release about a new study. We might do a press conference at a meeting. We might write a blog post or a news story. We might publicize it on social media. We might do some sort of multimedia project. There are really a lot of different ways that we promote and publicize newsworthy research. So from the perspective of a public information office, I'm going to talk about, what does newsworthy mean? So first, one second. There we go. Okay, so first we'll just kind of talk about what newsworthiness means in general as a term. And so what we mean by that is, will it captivate a journalist audience? And so it's really important, and an important distinction to make is that newsworthiness does not mean scientific importance. They're very different. So some scientists may think that if we say something is not newsworthy, that means it's not scientifically important, but that's absolutely not true. All science is important. It all serves a purpose, and it's really great. But that just doesn't mean that it will always captivate a journalist or their audience. And so it's a kind of a harsh truth, but it's just something that scientists need to accept. And so when you're thinking about what's newsworthy, it's just helpful to put yourself into the shoes of the reader. Think about, just a person on the street. If you were just picking up a newspaper and going to read a science story, what is the kind of story that you would want or need to hear about? So along those lines, I'm actually going to back up a second and talk about news in a very broad general sense. So not just talking about science, but in general. what are the kind of criteria that reporters look for when they're covering news? This is not an exhaustive list by any means. There are probably other criteria that aren't here, but in general, news means new. It has to be something that's new, happening now, it's timely. Often it's impactful, which means it has a significant impact on people's daily lives. Often news can be local, it can affect a certain area or community. Sometimes it's just very odd or weird or unusual. It usually has a human interest element, affects people in a personal way. And things like superlatives are always good news stories. Something is the first, the best, the last, the longest, the oldest, the largest, those kinds of things are generally criteria that go into making something newsworthy. And then when you talk about science and scientific results, there's criteria. This criteria applies to science as well. So what we look for, as a press office, is that when we're looking at a research paper or a presentation at a scientific meeting, we're looking for new results. And so if results are newsworthy, that usually what we're looking for is something that is new or previously unknown. So a new discovery, perhaps. Some results that are unusual in some way or maybe counterintuitive that kind of go against our usual way of thinking. If something represents a significant advancement to the field, or if it relates to a current event, maybe a well-known historical event, or even a landmark. So here in the images on the slide, you can see a couple of examples. So starting from the left and going to the right, the left is a news story written in the New York Times about canyons that were discovered filled with methane on Saturn's moon, Titan. And so this is a good example of a brand new discovery, and that's why it was newsworthy. And so another one, going to the right, is this story about sharks actually have some surprising social networks. So this represents a kind of news story that, where the science was really unusual and interesting and also counterintuitive. Sharks are typically seen as, kind of the lone wolves of the ocean. People think of them as very solitary creatures, but this research found out that actually they're more social than we think they are. So that was what made that particular scientific study newsworthy. Then all the way on the right, this story about the White Cliffs of Dover, the research was actually about an algal bloom that happens down in the Southern Ocean every year, but which itself is not super interesting, but the organisms that bloom are actually the same ones that laid down the chalk that became the White Cliffs of Dover. So this algal bloom every year can help us understand how this iconic landmark formed. It's often the first view of England seen from crossing over from Europe. So it's something that relates to something that's already well known. Some other reasons why a scientific paper might be newsworthy is if the results impact our daily lives, if they change our understanding of the universe, if they go against the current consensus, or if they have a striking visual element or even auditory element, if there's a photo or a video. So again, going from the left to the right, here's an example. Scientists linked Hurricane Harvey's rainfall to climate change. That obviously had an impact on people's lives. It was a very devastating natural disaster. So that's why that study was newsworthy. And then in the middle there is a study about volcanic lightning. And volcanic lightning doesn't really have much of an effect on our lives, but it's very, very cool and it's very visually stunning. So that was what gave that study some newsworthiness. And then all the way on the very right, again, that's a brand new discovery. When the gravitational waves discovery came out 2 years ago, that not only is it new, it also changes our understanding of the universe in a very dramatic way. So here's and again, like I said, this is not an exhaustive list. There are other things that might make a study newsworthy, but these are kind of the general things that we look for as a public information office when we're looking for science that we're going to promote to the press and to the public. So along those same lines, let's go look at the other side of it. So what science is not newsworthy? So, like I said, not all science is newsworthy, and that's totally okay. That's just the way it is. I would say here at AGU, we publish more than, 6,000 or so papers in our journals every year, and we publicize maybe a few percent of that, So it's a very small percent that we actually publicize. So the things that we might not publicize, we might not find newsworthy, are when the results are more incremental. They're not a significant advance, more of an incremental advance. If it's just an improvement of a model or a current technique that's already being used. If the results confirm something that's already known. If they're summarizing the latest in the field, so for example, a review paper. and if they've already been reported by the news media. So again, these aren't always hard and fast rules. There are exceptions occasionally. For example, if a review paper has, a new analysis or a new outlook on a topic, then that might make it newsworthy. But this is a general criteria that we don't look for. All right. Oh, sorry, I'm going to go back. And so now I'm going to hand it off to Ben, who's going to talk to you from his perspective, what makes his science newsworthy.
Great, thanks very much. So I'd like to talk about it's certainly science, but is it news? And to give a brief recap of what a journalist looks for. So we are competing online with Twitter, with YouTube. There are so many different avenues and outlets that are competing for people's attention. So I have picked out the 4 A's that we've identified, broadly speaking, that can attract readers in. And this comes from some research that Jonah Berger, who is a marketing professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and what he did, he asked some undergraduate students to read news articles and other forms of media, and then he observed what was shared. And it turns out that high emotional arousal increases the transmission of information. And so what do we mean when we say high emotional arousal? Well, they're emotions like awe. So that's why you don't see a lot of stories cover emotions like contentment, like it's news is new because it changes something, it brings something to the table. So we have awe, amusement, anxiety, and anger. And what does a science journalist look for? Well, it turns out those are the 4 same things. To get back to a point that what Lauren had said was it can be really important science, but it might not hit some of these fields, and it might not have that element that a journalist is looking for. I have a background in bioengineering. I was a lab rat for a few years, and so was trained, to identify what's important for a scientific publication. When I switched over to journalism, I had to realize that while a scientific fact might be incredibly valuable, it just might not have the same appeal as a science journalist. So we're looking for the same things. And what do I mean by awe? Well, these are the gee whiz sort of stories. So if there's something that helps us think of our universe in slightly a different way, these are the perennial favorites like dinosaurs or black holes. And if there's some compelling thing, if you can think of from your day at the lab bench, and then you go to the bar, you tell your neighbor, what was the coolest thing that you've done in your field recently, something you just might bring up in a conversation. Moving on, does this solve a mystery that has been longstanding in science? Is there some appeal that we can bring in here? And tied into that is, what's the significance? Is this a record or a first? Superlatives are really important. I love seeing superlatives when I'm reading a scientific paper. The example I give here is the detection of the gravitational waves, which was a huge story in astronomy, not only because this was the first time that we were able to see the 2 neutron stars merging, but it was also described as a new era in astronomy. We had not only the ability to see things with our telescopes, but we could sense them with the gravitational wave detectors. And while I'm looking at this, what's going through the back of my mind is, does it pass the headline test? And what I mean by that is there a piece of information from the paper that I'm reading, the press release that I'm looking at, or if I'm sitting down in a conference, that I could see as a potential headline? And that might be good to think of if you are thinking of pitching some of your science, trying to get that in front of the eyeballs of a journalist. What might be the big take home, the big takeaway that science that readers of science could look for? And that's not to say that that headlines are going to capture all of the nuance and complexity of your research. That's important, and that's why we hope people click on the headlines and read the actual story. But is there some element of your work that could be broken down and distilled into a headline? And so that's one of the considerations I have. The next A is amusement. So science is full of really compelling aesthetics with art and video or charts and graphics. There have been instances when a very compelling video has moved the needle, and I've decided to cover something because the video is just so compelling. On the right here, I have a example of this 3-foot long, really gooey clam that was found about 2 years back now, and then the research came out in April. Whoops. I can't see the slide anymore, but what was there was this giant clam, and there was a great video of the clam being laid out and cracked open from its shell, and it was just really compelling and awesome to see. And that brings me to humor too. A lot of science is funny. There are great anecdotes of people using different sorts of items in their research. I was talking to a guy who studies microfossils from butterfly scales, and what they had to use to move the butterfly scales around underneath a microscope was a tool tipped with a human nose hair, because it turned out the nose hair was just the right was just delicate enough and yet strong enough to push the fossils around. So if there's something kind of funny or amusing that happened in your work, feel free to volunteer that to a journalist. Journalists love trying to get that human element of science in. It's not always just about, hey, here's a really dramatic result, but tell us a little bit about how you came to find what you find, and if there's some element of humor there, that's always great to see. And then another big draw is anxiety. Is this study relevant to my life? And I don't mean just anxiety like it's terrible news, and we don't want to fearmonger, but we do want to portray things as accurately as possible. People are very interested in, for instance, this study of looking at the injection of wastewater from fracking into into the Texas region, and there was a link that researchers were able to make between these injections of wastewater and earthquakes. And if you're living in this area, that's something you want to know. Proximity can also be a big draw for local newspapers. So the Post can't cover every local researcher that does something important for her or his community, but you might want to think about, can you target this at the local daily, who might be fascinated to find out if someone's doing something that's important for instance, I don't know, maybe the health of the local wildlife or things like that. And does your research have some sort of implications that readers could take away for their lives? And I want to make a plea that it's important. The burden is on the journalist to look and see, okay, does this study show some sort of risk? And if it does, clearly lay that out in the article. But I would encourage you, if there's ever a chance where you see maybe a journalist isn't grasping something quite the way that they should, to feel free to say, well, this is absolute risk versus relative risk, in order to make sure that your science is being portrayed as accurately as possible, especially when you're dealing with things that a reader might take away and then want to try to apply to the way she or he lives. And then anger is a really compelling element of why people read news stories. And it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be incredible conflict or drama, but is this a contested issue? There were two camps of researchers looking at why monkeys couldn't generate sounds similar to human speech, with one camp suggesting that, well, maybe their larynxes and their physiology couldn't handle it. The other saying, no, they don't have the right brain circuits. And that led to some really interesting tension there, and a story that I wrote last July. There could be internal drama too. This goes back to leading to the human element. Did you struggle on your search to make this result that you have? Was there a particularly trying time when you were out at the field that you can show to the journalist, and you can tell that story, and you can humanize some of these aspects of science that are really important to do? And here I'd like to talk a little bit about why research gets covered. So how do you get your science in front of the eyeballs of a science journalist? So I try to keep an eye on what's coming out in the latest journal publications. I have several journals that I check pretty regularly to see what's going out. I've also started using preprint servers a little bit more just to get a sense of, in my beats, what are the next things that are coming out, what are people publishing on now, and what's going to happen in the future. Press releases are also very valuable, especially when they're embargoed, which lets the journalist give some time to do some research before the embargo lifts. One point about press releases that I found relatively interesting: in 2016, there was a PLOS One study looking at how exaggerations and caveats in press releases translated into the general news media. And this was specifically looking at health and science news, but I think it's more broadly applicable, or you can at least think of it like that. And what they found was that if there were exaggerations in the press release or caveats, then those ended up getting into the news media. So that I'm not trying to shift the blame away from journalists. Journalists should be doing their due diligence to make sure that what they're reporting is accurate. But I would encourage you, if you have a good working relationship with your public information office at your university or institution or wherever you are, to really go over that press release and make sure, hey, if journalists are going to be leaning on this, to make sure that that nothing is exaggerated, and if you have an important caveat that you'd like to include that caveat in your research. In your press release about your research, pardon me. I would really encourage you to do that. And then conferences are also a great source of where science journalists get some ideas of what to cover. Are there talks that are drawing in a lot of a big audience, and then I'll be drawn to that as well. What are people talking about, around the water fountain at the conference, and things like that. And what a journalist keeps in mind. So timing is a really important one. Is this study going to be available to me in a certain time frame that I need? Sometimes I'll come across a study that looks really fascinating, but it was published 3 months ago or something, and that's a little too old for what the post is looking for in terms of science. Or if maybe I'm working on something else and I simply can't get to it, it doesn't mean that the research isn't valuable or even newsworthy. It's just journalists tend to work on really fast time schedules, and then that means that they're pretty compressed for time when they have to do that. Access is really key, and what I mean by access is, can I get a hold of you to talk to you about your research? And when I do, can you help me understand what your work what your work means? Can we have a meeting of the minds where I have to serve my readers and you can portray your science in an accurate way, but also making it accessible? And if you do a great job, then I'm going to definitely take down your name in the future. So when I have to cover a topic again, I can go back and I can say, hey, this person was really articulate and helpful, and it's not necessarily that you have to speak it in sound bites, but you workshopped a metaphor with me that helps drive the science across, and I will see that as very, very valuable down the future too. And then finally, does it meet our publications needs? And part of that is, have we covered this recently? So you might have a great story about earthquakes on Mars or something that were discovered, but we just covered the tectonics of space. I'm making up this example, but we have to think of what our past coverage has been. But maybe 6 months ago we wrote a similar story and it did really well. So I would encourage you, if you're trying to think of a place to send your science to, if you're in the hopes of getting it coverage, I might encourage you to look at a publication and see, oh, well, in the past they have covered some similar research, so this might be a good publication to send my research to. And also check out the byline, because the odds are that that journalist will have covered that research in the past and would be open to doing it in again. And then and also to know, not all publications have the same necessarily goals. The Washington Post is different from a place like Science News, which is different from a place like the Wall Street Journal or Gizmodo or Fox. So being somewhat familiar with the way that these publications cover science. So at the Post, we certainly in the past 2 years have been looking a lot to see, well, does this aspect of science have a political or angle that might have some sort of clout in DC? What can this can we push this back to these bigger picture themes that we're seeing, like scientific funding under threat? So if you got a grant to do this research and now you're nervous that you might not have those funds in the future, someone like myself would be very interested in hearing about something like that. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're talking to a journalist and you're trying to get your work covered. And that's what I've got. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Carolyn. I am, again, the Earth and Climate Writer at Science News. So this is, I'm just showing you, as Ben mentioned, different outlets may have different needs. So I just want to give you a quick rundown of what Science News is all about. We are a biweekly print publication, but we also have, sort of a rolling lineup of online news, constantly changing. We are always focused on the latest scientific research. We don't really cover policy so much, although sometimes we do. And our audience is made up mostly of, we have scientists, we have science enthusiasts, we have a lot of science educators who read the magazine. So we're sort of looking at an audience that's already primed and interested in science. We don't feel like we have to convince them that science is interesting. They're already there. And we have a fairly small staff of perhaps 10 writers or so who all cover a variety of different science beats. So we run the gamut from biomedical to earth and climate to physics and beyond. Okay, so I wanted to a lot of what I'm going to say may reiterate some of what Ben had said, but I think that's actually good to drive some of the main points home for what journalists are looking for. I also want to take you guys a little bit through the process for me. So the first thing that I'm doing is I'm looking myself for story ideas. And what that means is I'm scouring numerous journals throughout the week for articles as they come out, and also looking at embargoed news releases, which, as Ben said, is very helpful because it gives journalists a few extra days to do their research before the story goes live. And of course, we haunt scientific conferences as well, looking for the freshest, hot off the presses news. And sometimes scientists also pitch me about their papers, which I really like. As I say, I can't promise I'm going to write about it, but I will definitely read it. And it's always nice to get a heads up if you have a paper coming out in a few weeks, just to have a little extra time to talk with you about it and think about it. So again, a lot of this is the same sort of information that you're getting, but it's really important to hammer home, what we consider to be new Basically, has it been extensively covered before? Is there a new advance? Is there a reason to write about it now? As always, does it have an impact on people or society in some way? When we ask you this question, this is not because we are trying to test you or challenge you. It's because we really want to know, and you may be in the best position to help see that connection if it's not immediately obvious. Again, does it advance, shift along standing debate? Oops, I don't know how that happened. So as Ben mentioned, his anger section, this is one of those things too. Is there already heightened interest in this topic? Is there a debate that's already ongoing? That can be part of a good narrative arc that helps to build a story. And one thing that I really wanted to mention is there good art? That's actually a really important aspect of, it can make a big difference. So moving here, so for example, good art will increase your chances of getting your story written about. I say by about 1 million, more or less. This is not an exact number. What is good art? Of course, we love cute animal pictures or scary natural disaster pictures. That's Kilauea there in the top left, top right. But there are many other kinds of good art that we would be interested in. Cool machines. This right here is ESRF. It's an Archaeopteryx fossil being examined. Or relevant lab work, such as the motions of the krill here. Actually, I think that's a brine shrimp, stand-in for a krill on the bottom right. But we also are always, at Science News at least, we are interested in graphs. As long as they are accessible and attractive, we actually like having data to show, but it needs to be data that we can actually understand. And as I say on here, we may ask researchers if there is an editable version, because we have a style and we want to put our own fonts on it. So just be prepared for that kind of stuff. We're not trying to change your data. So there we go. I didn't know if this is going to be a movie. There we go. Okay, so this actually, I just wanted to show this because this is an example of where we took the data, we took this video, and I think the video actually made a big difference in terms of being able to explain what was going on here. So, at Science News, we can be kind of wonky. We like this kind of data. But this is, this helped push the story over to show exactly what's going on. This is a story about how the solar eclipse last year actually set off a wave in the upper atmosphere due to temperature differences. Okay. So, once I have decided the things that I'm interested in, I also need to get it past my editor. He or she has to like it too. And there are a few things that I'm going to need to be able to do that. Number one, I want to make sure that I understand the study and can give the elevator pitch. Doesn't have to be an emoji, but it can actually be, it needs to be something fairly easy to explain. And so I just want to reiterate that, yes, we read those plain language summaries. Those are actually very helpful, so please do take care with them. It's a really good chance to sell your story as something that's newsworthy. And we're always going to want to know why we care. Every editor ever is going to ask that question. So title impact or gee whiz, both of those are reasons to care. They're going to ask about art as well. And then once we get to the point where we actually decide to talk to the researcher about the story, I think Ben alluded to this as well, we want to be able to be, we want you to be accessible. That it really makes a big difference. I am a reporter. I'm not the enemy. I'm not trying to challenge you. I want to get the facts right just as much as you do, but it needs to be readable. So I will, want to flag jargon. It's easier if you can sort of, as you say, workshop a metaphor, as Ben said. And of course, this has been a Twitter discussion recently, but journalists do not want to send the full stories to sources ahead of publication. That's not what we do. However, we are willing to discuss with you any points of any questions. And I definitely want to hear stories, which I will talk about in a second. One other thing I wanted to mention was a lot of times journalists will reach out to scientists in a field to be a, quote, outside source. That means someone who's not connected with the study that we're writing about at that moment. And that's actually part of how we build a network of scientist sources, people that we want to talk to. Again, it's always very helpful when someone is willing to be available for that. I understand you can't always be available, but it's a great way to put somebody on the Rolodex, to use an old term, and then we keep you on the short list. If we find that we're able to have a conversation and get some good ideas, then we'll likely reach out again and again and keep an eye out for your work as well. So to go to the stories thing, yes, I love to hear stories. Your anecdotes are awesome, ridiculous fieldwork stories, funny names you give your lab work. Even if we don't use those in a story, they help to give some context. We definitely want to talk to you on the phone if possible, because the quotes just sound a lot more natural and human. And also it's easier to ask follow-up questions and actually have a conversation and make the story clearer and more accurate. One thing that I want to mention is that, I think scientists are trained to remove themselves from the story and to talk in a passive voice in the story so that there's no sense of human agency, but that's not what readers generally want. Readers like to know that the scientists are people. They like to see the process of science, at least our readers do, and they like the human aspect. They like to read about other people, and so we want to talk about things in an active way. We want to show personality when we can. And so one recent example I just wanted to give was this was actually in the supplemental material of the science paper about gravitational waves. They actually included the entire Slack chat that they had, where the scientists discovered something in the images, and so that was actually really exciting to read, and it gave sort of a human interest to this story. So I think that's what I have, and I'm ready for questions.
Okay, great. And we'll go to questions in just a second. This is Nancy from AGU's Public Information Office. So we heard from Ben and Carolyn about how to kind of best work with reporters, what they're looking for, and we just want to talk a little bit about how to work with your Public Information Office. So I think Lauren mentioned previously, most of your institutions, universities will have some sort of press office or communications office, or goes by many different names, public affairs office. So, look them up, make contact with them if you're interested in being a resource to journalists, if you're interested in talking to reporters, introduce yourself and tell them a little bit about what you do. And always kind of keep them, it's a good idea to kind of keep them in the loop about what's going on. I mean, even if you're reaching out to reporters, yourself, let them know that that's what you're doing. But also, the press office can help you, in terms of if you have something coming out or you want to be a resource to reporters. What a press office can do is if you have a big paper coming out, they can help you write a press release. That can help maximize kind of the impact that you might get, from that paper. I think as I think Ben mentioned, you can work with your press office to really craft what you want to say in that press release, so that that it's right, because that's what a lot of times the reporter sees, gets on their desk, and so you make sure that the science is explained right in there. They can also give you tips on interviewing, if that's something that you want to do, especially, radio and TV stuff, they kind of have hookups usually and can help you with that. And can also help you if you don't know who necessarily to reach out to for a story. If it's a local story, they may know the local reporters and can hook you up. So it's always good to kind of keep your press office in the loop and connect with them if you're interested in connecting with reporters. And then we just wanted to mention, here at AGU, Lauren, I guess, already kind of went over, what we do, but how you can best work with us, and this goes for probably, other kind of journals as well. And I guess just in general, if you plan to publish a paper or present at a conference, let us know, but let us know early. And that means, as soon as you submit your paper, as soon as you submit your abstract, and that goes for your own press offices as well. Usually once the paper is published, it's too late to put out a press release. It happens, but generally it's good to just keep everyone in the loop from the beginning. Of course, there's a long way through peer review and from there, but just so your press office has a heads up, they can get started on it. So when the paper comes out, they're ready with the press release, or they're ready to connect you with reporters, or whatever it may be. So for us, you can always email us at news@agu.org. We're happy to answer any questions, help you with anything you need, obviously specific to AGU journals and AGU meetings, but Sharing Science also, in general, helping you with, interview tips and connecting you with your press office. We work with dozens of institutions all over the world. So we can always also hook you up with your own press office. So, and lastly, just want to talk a little bit about, you know, you don't have newsworthy research, but you still want to work with journalists. And I think Carolyn already mentioned this too, you know, be an expert for journalists. Make yourself available. Go to your press office and tell them that you want to be an expert. You have expertise in a certain area and you want to be a resource. A lot of them have these lists. We get called a lot here at AGU if something happens, something's in the news, or a big study comes out looking for experts, and we have those lists that we take from Sharing Science. So if you're interested, you know, reach out, become part of the Sharing Science network, reach out to us directly and let us know, because we're happy to help connect you with reporters. And then also, you know, you can kind of work on establishing a relationship with a journalist. You know, invite them out to, you know, see your lab or in the field with you. Tell them about what's going on, the stuff that you're tracking in your field that they might be interested in. Let them know when you might have a paper coming out. You know, these are all kind of goodwill things that go a long way with kind of establishing that relationship. So when you do have something newsworthy or they do need an expert, you know, they're the folks, you're the folks that they're going to call on. So, and with that, I think, Shane?
Yep. All right, so before we get to questions, and just, we had this up earlier, but to ask a question on the right-hand side on that panel for the actual webinar, there's a little questions box, and so you can ask questions there, and we'll get to as many as we can. But before we get to that, so just few quick things. We actually created this this quick guide to newsworthy science. It's a sheet of paper, the size of a sheet of paper, but a front and back on basically, is your science newsworthy? When is it newsworthy, yes or no? And then kind of a worksheet to work through. And you can find that on our website, sharingscience.agu.org, and it's online and on Twitter and all that jazz. We actually did a webinar last year about more general tips on working with the media, and that's archived at this link, and the same link that this webinar will be archived at. If you're on social media, you can follow Sharing Science and AGU through a number of different ways. You can follow our policy shop as well. And then Nancy mentioned this, but if you're interested in this type of thing, if you're a scientist who's really interested in sharing their science to whether it's journalists or to just members of the general non-scientist public or to policymakers, whatever it might be, we have what we call the Sharing Science Network, which is a group of scientists interested in such things. We provide extra opportunities, resources. There's an online community where folks can actually chat back and forth about the experiences they've done. So we encourage you to check into that as well. And you don't need to be an AGU member to be part of the Sharing Science Network. This is available for any scientist, communicator, what have you. All right, so having said that, we're going to get to some questions. And like I said, you can continue to ask throughout. So the first one, and I can answer this one, will the slides be available or a PDF form or in whatever form? So actually, after the webinar, probably by early next week, we'll send out a link to this recording. It'll be on YouTube. So you'll be able to go back and reference the webinar, pass it along to folks. So the short answer is yes. All right, so I'm going to send this one to Ben just because it was asked when he was speaking, but anyone can answer this. Do you think scientists and science reporters use social media any more or less than the general public? So kind of this idea, beyond that first tweet or Facebook post, does the story have legs? So Ben, if you wouldn't mind starting with this one.
Sure. So what I'll say is yes, definitely I find that social media is a very valuable resource as a journalist. And at the Speaking of Science section at the Post, I'm pretty positive I can think of a few hashtags that scientists have promoted that have turned themselves into fun online stories that we've written about. There's the I think it's the mammal madness that might happen with some biologists every March as a counterpoint to March Madness, where they do runs off of different mammals. And I know we did some coverage of that either this March or last March. So I would say that yes, certainly that social media is an important role for journalists, and not only to promote stories, but also to news gather. So if I am covering a topic, I might see, what scientist is tweeting about this research. I'll put in, maybe a link to a paper and see what comes up on Twitter to see who's reacting to this. And even if it's not this, even if it's not the study author who's tweeting about his or her work, I might see someone providing a caveat to this, or say, hey, this is really important, and more people should be talking about this. So I think that from the science communication aspect, social media can be very valuable to scientists, and then also to reporters who want to share their stories, but also from the news gathering perspective.
Yeah, this is Carolyn. I'm going to chime in for 1 second and add to that. So in this webinar, we're focusing largely on what is newsworthy, meaning, what do we report on as news? But of course, we also do other kinds of stories. We do feature stories, trend stories, that kind of stuff. And so a lot of times I spend a lot of time on Twitter just sort of reading what are people chattering about. I'm very interested to see, are there things that I had missed that people are talking a lot about? And I have used those, I can think of several occasions where I've used those as jumping off points for feature story pitches or trend story pitches, because it means that people are still thinking and talking about something that may have happened a month or two ago, but it does have legs. And so it's very useful to see what the community thinks in that way.
Great. So this is, let's say, I guess for any of you, but where to go? Oh, so for audiences, or for your audiences, is going to the field or some sort of an adventure, or maybe just even the day-to-day lives of scientists, is that strong enough story to pitch, or do you have to wait until you have that compelling result?
So yeah, generally you want to have some sort of a new result to pin the story to. I mean, just going into the field isn't always enough, although, a field expedition itself might be, a news peg for us. It sort of depends, it's definitely going to depend on the situation, or the lab. But generally we're going to want something to make it seem like there's a reason to write about this story now, that we're not, something that we could have written about 10 years ago, for example.
This is Lauren from AGU. I'll chime in here too. I mean, again, for news stories, as Carolyn was saying, you probably want some sort of news peg. But for other types of stories, or even other types of media, just going into the field may be interesting enough. For example, at AGU, we just started a podcast where we focus on the scientists and the methods behind the science. So that might be a great story for a podcast, what you're doing in the field, if you're doing something unusual or really adventurous, or it could be even a fodder for a feature story, as Carolyn was saying, but it might not be a news story per se. But, if you're going into the field and you're doing something for the first time, I mean, for example, the first time people ever went to Antarctica, that would have been a news story, but obviously that was a long time ago. But those kinds of things are rare these days. But if you're doing something new that no one has ever done before, that's probably
I would just add to that. Yeah, I think new methods are also very interesting. So if people are using new techniques, going to a new place, that kind of stuff is still newsworthy in its own way.
Yeah, just to chime in, if there's a journalist who you think might be interested in accompanying you when you go and do something cool, that would be a fantastic pitch to say that, hey, I'm going to be the first person to go to X area and do Y sort of method. Would you like to document that? That, not always is that going to happen, and that's certainly not something that's a consideration for the daily news cycle. But I always try to get out of the office when I can, so I'm always looking for something like that.
All right. So another one we got is how do reporters handle or report on preliminary results, like at a meeting or on a preprint server or something like that?
Yeah, I'll go real quick. This is Carolyn. So yeah, it's a tricky one. We report on conferences a lot, and I go to a lot of conferences. And I guess the main thing is we try to get outside commenters, as I had mentioned in my talk. We want to get other people's take on this, and so ideally it's someone who was actually there in the room and also saw the talk at the same time that I did, and so I'll sort of keep track of who asked questions right after the talk ended, for example, or who is at a person's poster asking questions, and try to get their immediate reaction and get some context for it.
And this has been at the Post, and we will cover preprint reports, but we are there's a higher threshold of getting outside comment because we know that it hasn't gone through peer review yet. So we want to make sure that if we're going to cover it, the science has to be very solid. We'll probably do more than our share of we'll go beyond the normal due diligence that we do in getting outside comment because it hasn't gone through that formal peer review process yet.
Yeah, this is Lauren. I'll just add quickly too. I mean, as these guys said, it happens a lot at meetings when you guys are presenting abstracts. But at AGU, we certainly publicize research at our meetings that is preliminary and press conferences and otherwise. And we always, make sure to make that very clear that the results are preliminary if they haven't necessarily been peer reviewed yet, and then do our due diligence as well and let the reporters do that too to get that extra buffer layer of security in there.
All right. So this is one for I guess all of you again, but many people think press releases are outdated. Do you? And I guess I'll go to Ben and Carolyn first as people who probably pick up press releases, and then to Lauren and Nancy as people who write press releases.
Yeah, this has been, I would say that press releases are valuable, especially when I get them ahead of an embargo, because normally as part of the press package, that's where I'll see those really compelling images, or oftentimes what I always look for is a link to the paper. So if there's a way to incorporate a PDF copy of the paper as part of the press release package, that is always a plus. I love to see that. And then maybe, if there are figures or data from the paper that's included as part of the press release package too, that's always fun to see. So I would say that I'm curious where the outdated idea comes from, as far as at least for myself, I see them as a valuable heads up that this is coming down the pike.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I'm curious about the outdated thing too. I wouldn't say that, there's no reporter worth her salt who's going to just use the press release. Obviously, you have to do your own work. But they can be very useful jumping off points, and they can give you all of those, bells and whistles that you might want, some clues about who you might want to talk to. And yeah, it's just a jumping off point. It's one of the tools in the toolbox.
Yeah, and I think this is Nancy, as someone who writes press releases and puts out press releases. I think one of the important things we're talking about here today is newsworthiness, and that's something here actually at AGU. I mean, as Lauren said, we publish over 6,000 papers a year in our journals. I mean, we put press releases out about maybe 60 of them. So, our threshold is pretty high. We're not sending out, 3 press releases a day just about any kind of thing. It has to pass a certain threshold. It has to be, pretty newsworthy for us to want to put out a press release. So I think that's kind of, as we're talking about newsworthiness, when you think about press releases, they do have to, reporters get a lot of stuff in their inbox, so it has to really catch their eye. I think on the flip side, there are many other ways to reach reporters. It's not just press releases these days. Like, we've heard, I mean, there's social media, there's, we have kind of a blog, or there's, looking through preprints, looking through the journals, pitching an individual study. I mean, there's just so many different ways to kind of reach reporters that it's just one kind of tool that we use. But I think press releases are still valuable in science reporting. I mean, maybe in some other areas, when they're really, kind of hyping up something. But I think in science reporting, at least the ones that we see in the institutions we work with, if they're really solid press releases about solid newsworthy science, they still get coverage and get reporters' interest. So I think that's
definitely. I mean, AGU Science, we definitely still gets covered a lot, and we do through our press releases. So
yes,
yeah.
Okay, so I guess this is another question for all of you, potentially differing answers. But do you allow scientists to see the story / provide edits before publication? And again, this probably is different for a news story versus a press release.
Right. I mean, for news, the answer is pretty much no. No, we don't do that. I don't think most news organizations would think that that is a proper practice. You know, we can read back quotes to you over the phone. We can do things like that, but we're not going to send you the story. Or, you know, if there are things that we want to check with you, I think a lot of reporters always want to, you know, double check facts and things like that. But yeah.
Just a second, that this is what Carolyn said. That's right on. Yeah, we have an editorial policy that no one outside of our outside of the post sees any sort of copy before we publish it. But I am happy to call you back and make sure that what we had, you know, from our conversation is accurate, because to get back to Carolyn's great point, you know, journalists aren't out to get anyone. If we're covering the news of science, we want to make sure that we get it accurately. We're not the enemy. So if that takes place in summarize, you know, a summarized email that I'll shoot that doesn't reflect the actual written language of the report or phone call, you know, we're happy to do that as needed. But you know, you wouldn't let a politician look at a draft of an article before you go to publish it. So I'm not sure it'd be the same, you know, for science too. So.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously for press releases, you know, we're promoting your work and we want to get it right. So we do let scientists, you know, look at the press releases beforehand. But you also, I think, and maybe, I don't know if someone mentioned this, but, you know, even in a press release, when you're working with your institution or with us or whomever, and you have edits, you have to realize that, you know, maybe not all your edits, you know, are necessary. You know, sometimes people may insert jargon back into it that we have, you know, we've intentionally not put in that jargon. And we can, obviously, we always want to work with the scientists, make it as accurate as possible, it's your work. We want to represent it accurately and something that you're happy with, but have to realize that a news story is going to be, or a press release, which is basically almost like a news story, is written, you know, differently than you would write a scientific paper. I mean, I think the other thing is always, you were mentioning, you know, be available, you know, so if, you know, at the end of your conversation with a reporter, especially maybe ones you don't know, say, hey, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, feel free to call me, and, you know, respond to the emails, pick up the phone, especially, you know, and I know at the AGU conference, we tell all our, you know, press conference attendees, you know, be available afterwards if folks have questions, because that's one way that you can help them get it right, is to be available and answer those questions.
And work with your press office as well beforehand. If you have a big study coming out, they can help prep you for an interview, make sure that you're honing your message right and you're explaining things in a way that's accessible, easy to understand. They can help you, you know, come up with some good metaphors and things to really drive home your point to the reporters to make sure they get it right.
But I guess just lastly, I mean, we always tell scientists, you know, do not expect that you will get to read your story. I mean,
yeah.
when you hang up the phone, when you know, leave the press conference, whatever it is, you know, say goodbye. That may be your last contact until you see it in print. So just don't go in with an expectation, and don't, you know, that's not something that you should be expecting when you talk to a reporter.
Great. All right. Well, we had a ton of questions. We could only get to a few. But that's all the time we have. So thank you, all of you, for participating today. Thanks especially to Ben and Carolyn for being here with us, and of course, Nancy and Lauren for providing their expertise. And like I said before, we will send out a link to this when it's available online, and you can check out all our other resources at our website. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.